The hospital fired her at 7:42 p.m. At 7:47 p.m., 3 Black Navy SEAL vehicles stopped outside the emergency entrance, asking for the same nurse they had just thrown away. Nobody at Riverside Memorial Hospital knew why. Not the doctors, not the nurses. Not even the emergency department head who had just taken away her badge and told her she was no longer needed. Because the quiet nurse they had underestimated for years was not who they thought she was. And the Navy SEALs were about to reveal a secret that would leave the entire hospital speechless. Everyone at Riverside Memorial Hospital knew Emily Carter as the quiet nurse. She was the person who walked through the emergency department without making noise, the nurse who listened more than she spoke, the nurse who never fought for attention, never argued with doctors, and never tried to prove herself. She simply did her job. Every morning, Emily arrived 30 minutes early. She checked patient files before her shift began. She prepared emergency supplies before anyone asked. She remembered small details about patients that other people missed. A scared child who hated needles. An elderly patient who became anxious when left alone. A trauma victim who needed someone to hold their hand before surgery. Emily noticed everything, but in the ER. Being quiet was often mistaken for being weak. And that was exactly what Dr. Richard Hayes believed. The emergency department head had spent years building his reputation. He was known as a brilliant doctor, but also as someone who valued confidence above everything else. To him, the loudest person in the room was usually the strongest, and Emily was the opposite. One evening, during a busy shift, an ambulance rushed in with a critical patient. The entire trauma team moved quickly. Doctors shouted instructions. Nurses ran between rooms. Monitors beeped. Emily moved calmly through the chaos, preparing equipment and checking the patient's condition. She noticed something unusual. The patient's breathing pattern had changed. She immediately wrote a note and handed it to Dr. Hayes. "Doctor, I think we need to reassess. Something is changing." Dr. Hayes barely looked at the note. "Emily, this is not the time to overthink," she tried to explain. "The patient's condition is shifting." Dr. Hayes looked irritated. "Need nurses who can react, not nurses who hesitate." The room became quiet. A few nurses looked at Emily. Everyone knew what was happening. Again, Emily lowered her eyes and stepped back. But 30 seconds later, the patient's monitor changed. The exact problem Emily had noticed appeared. The doctors rushed to adjust treatment. The patient stabilized. For a moment, everyone knew Emily had been right. But Dr. Hayes did not admit it. He simply walked away. Later, in the nurses' station, one of the younger nurses whispered, "She notices things before anyone else." Another nurse replied, "Maybe, but she doesn't act like she belongs here." Emily heard them. She always heard more than people expected. Not because of the words, because of the way people looked at her. The next few weeks, it became harder. Dr. Hayes started criticizing everything she did. "You take too long. You don't communicate enough. You need to be more aggressive. You don't have the personality for emergency medicine." Emily accepted every criticism silently. Not because she agreed, because she had learned. Something years ago, some battles were not won by arguing. Some were won by surviving. But Dr. Hayes did not know that. Nobody at Riverside Memorial knew what Emily had survived. They did not know where she had worked before becoming a nurse. They did not know why she reacted differently during emergencies. They did not know why she stayed calm when everyone else panicked. They only knew the version of Emily they saw, a quiet nurse. A nurse who kept to herself. A nurse they thought was ordinary. Until one night, Dr. Hayes finally decided he had enough. The emergency department was crowded. A patient had just been transferred to surgery. The staff were exhausted. Emily was updating charts when Dr. Hayes walked toward her. Several nurses noticed his expression. Something was wrong. "Emily," she looked up. Double quotes. "Yes, doctor." He held a folder in his hand. "I have made my decision." The room slowly became quiet. Emily stood still. Dr. Hayes looked around at the staff. "I cannot continue having someone on my emergency team who does not meet the expectations of this department." A few nurses exchanged uncomfortable looks. Emily remained calm. May I ask what expectation I failed to meet? Dr. Hayes answered immediately. Leadership. A pause. Confidence. Another pause. Trust. Emily looked at him. Trust. Dr. Hayes nodded. In emergency medicine, I need people who I know can handle pressure. Emily almost smiled, because she knew something he didn't. Pressure was something she understood better than anyone in that room. But she said nothing. Dr. Hayes opened the folder. Effective immediately, your employment with Riverside Memorial Hospital is terminated. Silence. The words hit the room. Even the nurses who had criticized her looked surprised. Emily slowly removed her ID badge, the badge she had worn every day, the badge that represented years of helping people. She placed it on the desk. No anger, no argument, no begging, just silence. Dr. Hayes looked almost satisfied. Sometimes people have to accept when they are not suited for a job. Emily picked up her bag. Then she looked at him. For the first time that night, she spoke with complete confidence. Sometimes people make decisions about others without knowing their story. Nobody responded, because everyone felt the weight of those words. Emily turned and walked away. Through the emergency doors, past the nurses' station, past the patients she had cared for, past the hospital staff who had never really known her. Outside, rain was falling. Emily stood under the hospital lights, holding her bag, looking at the building where she had spent years serving others. She had no idea that only minutes later, the same hospital that had just fired her would be begging her to come back, because somewhere across the city, a Navy SEAL team was racing toward Riverside Memorial Hospital, and they were not coming for a nurse. They were coming for Commander Emily Carter. Emily Carter stood outside Riverside Memorial Hospital, holding the small bag that contained everything she had brought with her that morning, her final shift, her final day, her final moment as a nurse at the hospital that never truly understood her. Rain fell around her as she looked through the glass doors one last time. Inside, doctors and nurses continued working. Some avoided looking at her. Some looked uncomfortable. Few looked guilty, but nobody came outside. Nobody stopped her. Emily turned away. Then she heard something, not a voice, not a sound from inside the hospital. Something different. The ground seemed to vibrate. Several vehicles were approaching quickly. Black SUVs, military vehicles, the kind of vehicles that did not belong outside a city hospital. People inside Riverside Memorial immediately noticed. A nurse near the window frowned. Who are they? Another nurse moved closer to the glass. Those are military vehicles. The 3 SUVs stopped directly in front of the emergency entrance. The doors opened. Men wearing Navy SEAL uniforms stepped out. Their movements were quick, focused, urgent. The entire hospital changed instantly. Doctors stopped walking. Nurses looked toward the entrance. Security moved forward. The SEAL team leader entered the emergency department. Where is Nurse Emily Carter? The room became silent. Everyone looked at each other. Dr. Hayes stepped forward confidently. She doesn't work here anymore. The SEAL officer stared at him. What do you mean? Dr. Hayes adjusted his coat. Her employment was terminated minutes ago. The officer's expression changed. Minutes ago? Dr. Hayes nodded. The officer looked back toward his team. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the SEALs said quietly, "We came too late." The words confused everyone. Dr. Hayes frowned. You looking for her? The SEAL officer looked directly at him. Because we need her, nobody understood. The same nurse who had just been fired was suddenly the person the military needed. A nurse at the station whispered, "Why would Navy SEALs need Emily?" No one answered, because nobody knew. The officer quickly turned around. Where did she go? A security guard pointed toward the exit. 8. She just left. The SEAL team immediately moved. Outside, Emily had only walked halfway across the parking lot when she heard footsteps behind her. Commander Carter. She stopped. Slowly, she turned around. The rain continued falling, but Emily was no longer looking at a hospital employee. She was looking at people from her past. The SEAL officer stood in front of her. For the first time that night, Emily's calm expression changed. "Commander." The officer nodded. "We need your help." Emily looked at the hospital behind him, then back at the SEAL team. "I'm not a commander anymore." The officer shook his head. "That is not how we see it." Emily stayed quiet. The officer continued. "Our K-9 unit was injured during a mission." Emily's expression changed slightly. "Which K-9? The officer answered immediately. "Titan." For the first time all night, Emily looked worried. Titan was not just a military dog. He was part of her old unit. A partner, a teammate, someone she had trusted during some of the hardest moments of her life. What happened? The officer looked toward the vehicle. "He was injured during a training operation. His handler is unconscious. Titan survived, but he is refusing treatment." Emily understood immediately. A trained military K-9 did not simply refuse help. There was always a reason. "We won't let anyone near him," the officer continued. "We tried handlers. We tried veterinarians. We tried everyone." He looked directly at her. "But he responds to you." Emily looked down. Years ago, she had promised herself she would never return to that life. The missions, the danger, the memories. She had built a new identity. A quiet nurse, a normal life. But Titan was different. She looked at the SEAL team. "Where is he?" The officer pointed toward the vehicle. Inside the military transport was Titan. The large Belgian Malinois was lying on a padded surface, injured and exhausted. The moment Emily approached, Titan lifted his head, his eyes opened, and something happened that shocked everyone. The dog stopped struggling. The SEALs exchanged looks. One of them whispered, "He remembers her." Emily opened the vehicle door slowly. The hospital staff watched from behind the GLASS. Dr. Hayes stood there confused. The nurses stood there speechless, because the quiet nurse they had fired was now standing with a Navy SEAL team. And the military dog they could not control was watching only her. Emily stepped inside the vehicle. Titan. The dog slowly moved his head toward her. She raised her hand. A simple signal. One the hospital staff had never seen before. Titan immediately relaxed. Everyone watching froze. Dr. Hayes stared through the glass. What did she just do? The SEAL officer looked back at him. "You really don't know who she is?" Nobody answered. The officer stepped closer to the hospital doors. Emily Carter was not always a nurse. The staff listened. Before she worked here, she served with us. A nurse shook her head. "No," the officer continued. "She was a Navy SEAL medical specialist." The hallway went completely silent. The woman they called quiet. The woman they thought lacked confidence. The woman they had just fired was someone who had once walked into situations where most people would never survive. Dr. Hayes looked toward Emily for the first time, saw her differently, not as a nurse who failed his expectations, but as someone whose experience was beyond anything he understood. Inside the vehicle, Emily placed her hand near Titan. The dog leaned toward her. The SEAL officer watched. "Only you can reach him." Emily looked at the injured K-9. Then she said quietly, "Then let's bring him home." She had left Riverside Memorial Hospital as a fired nurse. But she was returning as something the hospital never knew she was. A hero. Asterisk the emergency department at Riverside. Memorial Hospital had never been this quiet. Not because there were no patients, not because the work had stopped, but because everyone was watching the same scene outside. The nurse they had just fired was standing beside a Navy SEAL team, calming a military K-9 that no one else could control. Dr. Richard Hayes stood behind the glass doors, unable to move. Only 20 minutes earlier, he had taken Emily Carter's badge and told her she did not belong in emergency medicine. Now he was watching her do something his entire team had failed to do. Titan trusted her, inside the military vehicle. Emily stayed completely focused. The dog was injured. The situation was serious. There was no time for old memories, no time for anger, no time to think about what the hospital had done. There was only Titan. Emily placed her hand near his harness. The Belgian Malinois touched her carefully. His eyes were tired. His breathing was uneven, but he was calm. "Easy, Titan," Emily whispered. The SEALs watched silently. They had seen Titan in dangerous situations. They had seen him follow commands under extreme pressure, but they had never seen him respond to anyone like this. One of the younger SEALs looked at his commander. "How does she do that?" The commander smiled slightly. "Because she understands him." Emily checked Titan's condition. She noticed things others had missed. The way he was protecting his injured side. The way he refused to move his front leg. The way his breathing changed. Whenever someone unfamiliar approached, she looked at the SEAL medic. "His pain is causing him to panic. We need to stabilize him before moving." The medic nodded immediately. Nobody questioned her. Nobody challenged her, because they knew exactly who she was. A person who had spent years making decisions when seconds mattered. Emily carefully guided the team, slowly, keep the lights low, no sudden movements. Every instruction was followed. A few minutes later, Titan was transferred from the vehicle into the emergency treatment room, the same room where Emily had been criticized, the same room where people had doubted her, but now the entire staff moved differently. They watched her. They listened. Dr. Hayes stepped aside as she entered for the first time. He did not give an order. He waited for hers. Emily noticed, but she said nothing. She had not returned for an apology. She had returned to save a life. The Navy. SEAL veterinarian arrived shortly after Dr. Sarah Mitchell examined Titan. She looked at the medical notes, then at Emily. "You stabilized him before transport?" Emily nodded. Dr. Mitchell looked impressed. That was exactly what he needed. The room became silent. Dr. Hayes looked away because he knew what that meant. Emily had done in minutes. What he had believed she could not do, the veterinarian continued working. "His condition is serious, but he is stable." The SEAL team released a breath of relief. Titan slowly turned his head toward Emily. Even while surrounded by medical equipment and unfamiliar people, he searched for her. Emily stepped closer. "You are okay now?" Titan relaxed. A small moment. But everyone saw it. Especially Dr. Hayes, the man he had called a weak nurse, was the only person who could calm a military. K9, the SEAL commander, walked toward Emily. "Commander Carter." Emily looked at him. "I told you I am not active anymore." The commander smiled. "Maybe not officially." He looked around the hospital. "But people like you do not stop being who they are." Emily looked down. She had spent years trying to leave that chapter behind. She had wanted a normal life, a quiet life. But maybe she had forgotten something. Being a hero was not about wearing a uniform. It was about helping someone when they needed you. The commander turned toward the hospital staff, especially Dr. Hayes. "You should know something." Everyone listened. Emily was one of the best medical specialists we had. The hallway became still. During her service, she treated injured operators under conditions where most people would have frozen. He paused. She saved lives. The nurses looked at Emily differently. The same nurses who had ignored her, the same people who thought her silence meant weakness. Now they understood. Her quietness was not a lack of confidence. It was discipline. Dr. Hayes looked uncomfortable. The commander continued. "She left the military because she wanted to dedicate herself to civilian patients." He looked at the hospital. "She chose to help people here." Nobody spoke, because the truth was painful. Emily had spent years helping them, and they had spent years underestimating her. Later that evening, Titan was finally stable. The SEAL team prepared to transfer him to a specialized military facility. Before leaving, the commander approached Emily. "We owe you." Emily shook her head. "You don't." The commander smiled. "You always say that." Emily looked confused. He continued. "Even when you saved people during missions, you never wanted recognition." He looked toward the hospital. "But tonight, these people need to know what they almost lost." Emily looked at the emergency department, at the place that had rejected her. Then she looked away. "I just did my job." The commander nodded. "That's exactly why you were good at it." As the SEAL vehicles prepared to leave, Dr. Hayes finally stepped outside. For a moment, nobody said anything. The emergency chief who had fired her stood face to face with the nurse he never understood. Emily, she looked at him. His voice was different now. Not confident, not commanding, just honest. I was wrong. The word surprised everyone. Dr. Hayes continued. I judged you without knowing your story. Emily stayed silent. I thought your quietness meant weakness. He looked toward the military vehicles. I was completely wrong. A long pause followed. Then Emily answered calmly. Most people see what is missing before they see what is there. Dr. Hayes lowered his head, because he knew exactly what she meant. The next morning, the hospital felt different. People no longer whispered when Emily walked by. They greeted her. They asked for her opinion. They listened, not because she had a military title, not because Navy SEALs respected her, but because they finally understood her value. A week later, Titan returned for a follow-up visit. The moment the canine entered the hospital, everyone stopped. The once injured military dog walked confidently through the doors. The staff smiled. The doctors watched, and then Titan ignored everyone. He walked straight toward Emily. He sat beside her. The hospital became silent. Emily smiled and placed her hand on his head. Still following orders? The SEAL commander laughed. Only yours. Everyone around them smiled. The same hospital that had fired Emily Carter now celebrated her, but Emily never changed. She was still the quiet nurse, still the person who walked softly, still the person who never needed attention, because real heroes do not need to announce who they are. Sometimes, they simply walk away from a place that does not value them, only to return when the world needs them most.